I still remember the exact moment when everything began to unravel. It was as if the world had suddenly fallen silent, and in the stillness, I heard the painful cracking of something deep inside me. My marriage, the one thing that had always felt solid, secure, was now slipping through my fingers like sand. We had been together for nearly a decade, yet it felt like we had drifted so far apart that we might as well have been strangers. The love that had once bound us seemed suffocated beneath layers of routine, unmet expectations, and unsaid words. I tried to convince myself that it was just a rough patch, a temporary storm. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't ignore the hollow ache that had taken root in my chest. I no longer recognized the man I had married, and perhaps even worse, I no longer recognized myself. My needs, my desires, they had become invisible in the chaos of our daily lives. I began questioning everything, wondering if it was too late for us, if I was wasting my time on something that could never be repaired. And so, one night, after another long wordless dinner where we barely made eye contact, I made the decision. I needed help. I found a family therapist online, someone who came highly recommended by a friend who had gone through her own struggles in marriage. Dr. Anderson's name stood out to me, and after reading his bio, I convinced myself that this was my last chance. If there was any hope for us, it had to be with someone neutral, someone who could see things more clearly than we ever could through the fog of our emotions. Our first session was a blur of discomfort and reluctant honesty. My husband, Greg, was distant, barely speaking, while I tried to articulate the many ways in which I felt unfulfilled, alone, and disconnected. Dr. Anderson was calm, patient, asking the right questions and listening with a depth that made me feel heard. It was strange to realize that I hadn't felt truly heard in so long. Week after week, we returned to Dr. Anderson's office, each session slowly peeling back the layers of resentment and frustration between Greg and me. It wasn't easy. I expected the sessions to bring us closer together, but instead, they seemed to deepen the emotional chasm. Greg was withdrawn, distracted by work or his own thoughts, while I was left trying to fix a marriage that felt broken beyond repair. Then, one session, Dr. Anderson asked me a question that would change everything. How do you feel about your relationship with Greg? Beyond the frustrations, beyond the issues, how do you feel? I sat there for what felt like an eternity, the question hanging in the air. I had never truly asked myself that. How did I feel? I had been so consumed by the fight to fix everything, to make it better for everyone else, that I never stopped to reflect on my own emotions. I don't know. I finally whispered, my voice trembling. I don't know who I am anymore. I don't know if I even know how to love him anymore. Dr. Anderson looked at me for a long moment, his expression soft. It's okay to not have all the answers right now, but you need to take the time to figure out who you are, not just as a wife but as yourself. You deserve that. I couldn't remember the last time someone had said something like that to me. It was like a door had been cracked open inside me, a door I had forgotten was even there. After that session, things began to shift. The lines between professional and personal began to blur, and I couldn't stop thinking about Dr. Anderson. I tried to push it aside, telling myself that it was normal to feel a sense of attachment to someone who was helping me through such a painful time. But the more I saw him, the more I found myself drawn to him, not just for his insight but for the way he saw me. Truly saw me. For the first time in years, someone was looking at me with a depth that felt personal. I caught myself thinking about him outside of our sessions. I started looking forward to our meetings, to the brief moments where he would lean in, where his eyes would meet mine with a softness that was almost too intimate. My heart would race, my palms would sweat, and I hated myself for it. It wasn't long before I started to blur the lines between therapy and something else. I wasn't just attending sessions anymore to fix my marriage. I was attending them to feel seen, to feel understood. Every time I left his office, I felt lighter, like a piece of me had been returned. There was a part of me that craved that connection, that comfort more than anything. It became an addiction. I started to miss him between sessions, and when we did meet, I found myself not just talking about my struggles with Greg, but about myself, about my doubts, my fears, my desires. It was a dangerous territory I was venturing into, and I knew it. I could feel the shift in the air. I wasn't just seeking help for my marriage anymore. I was seeking something else, something I wasn't getting at home. The realization hit me like a thunderclap. I wasn't just emotionally invested in my therapy anymore. I was emotionally dependent on Dr. Anderson. And I wasn't just looking for solutions to my marriage. I was looking for an escape. I tried to fight it. I told myself that I was just going through a rough patch, that my attachment was just a phase. But deep down I knew I was lying to myself. I wanted him. Not just as a therapist, not just as a source of comfort, but as a person. I wanted to feel his touch, hear his voice in a way that went beyond professional boundaries. But then the guilt would come crashing in. What about Greg? What about my marriage? Was this the way I was going to abandon everything I had built? The thought of cheating, of breaking the trust one had with my husband, sickened me. But the pull towards Dr. Anderson was so strong, so consuming. It was hard to think clearly, to separate the emotions from the reality. The tipping point came one evening, a week after one of our most intense sessions. Dr. Anderson had asked me to stay behind for a few moments to clarify something from our conversation. And for some reason I couldn't leave. I lingered, uncertain, standing in his office like a woman at the edge of something dangerous. "You seem different today," he said quietly, his voice lower than usual. "How are you feeling?" I stared at him, my heart pounding in my chest. In that moment I realized just how much I wanted him. My mind screamed at me to pull back, to walk away, but my body wouldn't listen. "I don't know," I said, my voice shaky. I feel like I'm at a crossroads." He stepped closer, his eyes locking with mine. "What kind of crossroads?" I swallowed, feeling the heat rise in my cheeks. "A crossroads where I'm not sure which path to take anymore. Where I'm not sure if I even know who I am without all of this. The therapy, my marriage." He was standing so close now, his presence overwhelming. The air between us felt charged, like something was about to break. "You're not alone in this," he said softly. "But sometimes the answers are buried deeper than we realize. And it takes courage to face them." I wanted to say something, to voice the turmoil inside me, but all that came out was a strangled breath. I could feel the temptation, the lure of something forbidden. And I knew deep down that I was no longer seeking answers. I was seeking something else entirely. I had to make a choice. The tension in the room was unbearable. Every breath I took seemed heavier than the last, as though the air itself was thick with the weight of my thoughts. I stood there, unsure of what to do, feeling a strange mix of guilt and desire stirring within me. Dr. Anderson's gaze was steady, and there was something in the way he looked at me. An understanding, a recognition of the struggle I was facing, that both comforted and terrified me. His calmness was like an anchor, but it only made me feel more adrift. "I think you're right," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "I'm lost. I don't know what to do with myself anymore. Everything feels broken." The words felt too big for me to carry, yet they spilled out, as though they had been waiting for their moment. Dr. Anderson's eyes softened, and he nodded slowly. "You're not broken, but I understand why you feel that way. The pain you're experiencing is real. The confusion you feel, it's a part of this process. And the only way forward is through it. You have to allow yourself the space to grieve what's been lost, and then only then can you start to rebuild." His voice was so gentle, but there was an undercurrent of something more. He wasn't just a therapist anymore. He was a guide, a steady hand, pulling me through the wreckage of my emotions. But it wasn't enough. It would never be enough. The moment I'd stepped into his office all those weeks ago, I'd known deep down that I wasn't just here to heal. I wasn't here just for my marriage. I had come looking for something else, something I couldn't name. The more time I spent with him, the more I began to crave his presence. And the more I craved it, the more I began to realize that the problem wasn't just my marriage, it was me. I had been living my life for everyone else. For Greg, for my family, for the image of myself that I thought I was supposed to be. I had forgotten what it was like to want something for myself. I had forgotten what it felt like to be seen, truly seen, for who I was, not for what I represented. And Dr. Anderson had given me that. I couldn't ignore it anymore, no matter how much I tried. "Dr. Anderson," I began, my voice trembling as I finally found the words. "I don't know if I can do this anymore. I don't know if I can go back to Greg and pretend like everything is okay. I don't know if I even want to." He didn't say anything at first, just studied me quietly, and for a moment I thought I saw something flicker in his eyes. Something that mirrored my own inner turmoil. Then he sighed, his voice low and measured. "I can't tell you what to do," he said softly. What I can tell you is that you're in a very vulnerable place right now. It's easy to mistake your feelings of longing and attachment for something more. What you need right now is clarity. You need to be honest with yourself. His words hit me like a wave, pushing me further into the depths of my own confusion. Was I confusing emotional dependency with desire? Was this attachment to him something born from my desperation to feel understood, to feel wanted? Or was it something deeper? Something I could no longer ignore? I didn't know. I couldn't see the lines anymore. Everything had become so tangled. And as much as I hated it, as much as I wanted to be strong, I couldn't deny the pull between us. Every time we met, it was like a magnetic force drawing me closer to him. It wasn't just his words, his kindness, it was something more subtle. His presence, his attention, the way he made me feel like I was the only person in the room. It was intoxicating. I needed to get away, to clear my head. I need some time, I said, stepping back a little. I need to think about everything. Dr. Anderson nodded, his expression unreadable. Of course. Take all the time you need. But remember, whatever decision you make, you need to be true to yourself. The answers you're searching for won't come from anyone else. They come from within you. I left his office feeling more conflicted than ever. The drive home was a blur. The hum of the tires on the road the only sound in the car. My mind raced, caught in a storm of confusion and guilt. I wanted to talk to Greg, to share everything with him, but I knew I couldn't. Not yet. Not when I was so unsure of my own feelings. When I got home, Greg was sitting on the couch, flipping through the TV channels absently. He didn't look up when I walked in, and the sight of him there, so distant, so detached, made my heart ache even more. I hated the way things had turned out between us, hated the way we had stopped trying. I went to therapy today, I said quietly, hoping to break the silence. He didn't respond right away, and when he did, it was in his usual distracted tone. Oh, how was it? Good, I said, unsure of how to elaborate. We talked about some things. Like what? He asked, still not really paying attention, his eyes on the screen. I wanted to tell him. I wanted to pour my heart out and explain how I was feeling, how much I was struggling. But I knew it would just lead to more silence, more avoidance. Greg had never been good at really listening, at truly hearing me. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that maybe that was why I had sought out Dr. Anderson in the first place. I felt a pang of guilt as I thought about how I had been drawing closer to him, emotionally at least. Was I betraying Greg? Was I already starting to cheat on him emotionally, if not physically? I couldn't shake the image of Dr. Anderson's face, the warmth in his eyes when he looked at me. It was like he understood my pain in a way no one else ever had. He saw me. And in that moment I wondered if I could continue living in a marriage that didn't see me at all. The weeks that followed were a blur of uncertainty. I continued therapy, each session pulling me deeper into a labyrinth of conflicting emotions. The more I spoke with Dr. Anderson, the more I realized just how much I had allowed myself to become emotionally dependent on him. I wanted his approval, his validation. I wanted him to tell me I was worth something. And every time he did, it felt like a breath of air after suffocating for too long. But at the same time, I couldn't shake the guilt. The guilt over my growing feelings for him, the guilt over the distance between Greg and me, the guilt over not being able to fix things. One night, after another tense evening with Greg, I found myself sitting in my car in front of Dr. Anderson's office, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. I was supposed to go home to try again with Greg. But all I could think about was how badly I needed to see Dr. Anderson. I needed him. I needed someone to see me, to help me make sense of all this. I texted him, asking if he was available for an impromptu session. He replied almost immediately, saying he could see me in 30 minutes. That was it. I was going. As I walked into his office that night, I knew I was at the brink of something irreversible. I didn't know what I was searching for, but I knew that I was searching for something. And if I wasn't careful, I might lose myself in the process. The office felt different that evening. The soft, ambient lighting cast long shadows across the walls, and the quiet hum of the air conditioning seemed louder in the stillness. I closed the door behind me and stood there for a moment, unsure of how to begin. Dr. Anderson looked up from his desk, his expression as calm and composed as ever, but there was something in his eyes, an awareness maybe, that made my chest tighten. "Take a seat," he said. gesturing toward the familiar chair across from him. His voice was steady, professional, but I could sense a subtle shift in the energy between us. It was as if we both knew this wasn't just another session. I hesitated before sitting down, clutching my bag tightly in my lap. The weight of the moment pressed down on me, and I struggled to find the right words. "I'm sorry for texting you so late," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. He shook his head slightly, a small, reassuring smile softening his features. "It's not a problem. I told you I'm here if you need to talk." Those words hit me harder than they should have. The sincerity in his voice was almost too much to bear. I looked down at my hands, trying to gather my thoughts, but my mind was a chaotic mess. What was I even doing here? What was I hoping to accomplish? "I feel like I'm unraveling," I admitted, my voice trembling. "I don't know who I am anymore. I don't know what I'm supposed to do. Every time I think I have an answer, it just slips away. And I'm left feeling even more lost." Dr. Anderson leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on the arms of his chair. His presence was steadying, like an anchor in the storm of my emotions. "It's okay to feel that way," he said gently. "You're carrying a lot right now. The uncertainty, the guilt, the pressure to make the right choice, it's overwhelming. But you don't have to have all the answers tonight. Sometimes it's enough just to acknowledge what you're feeling." I looked up at him then, and the way he was watching me, so intently, so completely, made my heart ache. I could feel the tears welling up in my eyes, but I didn't want to cry. "Not here, not now. I don't think I can do this anymore," I said, my voice cracking. "I feel like I'm failing at everything, my marriage, my life, even therapy. I keep coming here hoping you'll tell me what to do. But I know that's not your job. I feel so alone." The silence that followed felt heavy, but not uncomfortable. Dr. Anderson let my words hang in the air for a moment before responding, his voice calm and measured. "You're not failing," he said. "You're navigating something incredibly difficult. And feeling alone, that's valid. But you're not alone in this. You're here, and that's a step. It's a big step." I swallowed hard, trying to push back the lump in my throat. But what if I make the wrong choice? What if I ruin everything? He tilted his head slightly, considering my words. "What do you think the wrong choice would look like?" I froze at the question. My mind immediately jumped to Greg, to our crumbling marriage, to the life we had built together that was now hanging by a thread. But then just as quickly my thoughts shifted to Dr. Anderson, to the way he made me feel, to the growing pull I couldn't seem to resist. "I don't know," I said finally, my voice barely audible. "I just know that I'm terrified of losing myself." Dr. Anderson's gaze softened, and he leaned back slightly in his chair. "Sometimes we have to let go of what's no longer serving us to find ourselves again. That's not easy, and it's not without risk. But staying in a place where you feel stuck, where you feel invisible, that's a kind of loss too." His words struck a chord deep within me, and I felt a tear slip down my cheek before I could stop it. I quickly wiped it away, embarrassed by my own vulnerability. "I just don't know if I'm strong enough," I whispered. "You are," he said firmly, his voice filled with quiet conviction. "You're stronger than you think. And you're not alone in this. You have support, even if it doesn't always feel that way." The room fell silent again, but this time the silence felt different. It wasn't heavy or oppressive. It was comforting, like a pause in a conversation that didn't need to be filled. For a moment I just sat there, letting his words sink in, trying to steady my racing thoughts. But then as I looked at him, as I felt the intensity of his presence, I couldn't ignore the other emotions bubbling beneath the surface. The longing, the desire, the pull that had been growing stronger with every session. It was like a tide I couldn't fight anymore, no matter how much I tried. And in that moment I realized I didn't want to fight it. "I don't know what I'm doing here," I said finally, my voice trembling. "I don't know if I'm looking for answers, or if I'm just running away from everything." Dr. Anderson didn't respond right away, and when he did, his voice was quiet, almost hesitant. "It's okay to feel conflicted. Therapy is a space to explore those feelings, even the ones that are uncomfortable. But this isn't just about therapy," I said, the words slipping out before I could stop them. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could feel the heat rising in my cheeks. "This is about you." The air in the room shifted, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw something flicker in his expression, surprise, maybe, or something else I couldn't quite name. But then it was gone, replaced by the same calm, professional demeanor he always wore. Emotional connections can be complicated, he said carefully, his voice steady but softer than usual. It's not uncommon to feel a sense of attachment in this kind of setting, but it's important to understand where those feelings are coming from. I know where they're coming from, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. And I know it's wrong, but I can't help it. He leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped in front of him. It's not about right or wrong, he said gently. It's about understanding what you need and making choices that align with your values and your goals. That's not easy, but it's necessary. I nodded, but his words didn't ease the turmoil inside me. If anything, they only made it worse. I could feel the tears threatening to spill again, and this time I didn't try to hold them back. I just don't know what to do, I said, my voice breaking. I don't know how to stop feeling this way. He didn't say anything for a moment, just watched me with an intensity that made my chest tighten. And then finally he spoke, his voice soft but firm. The fact that you're willing to confront these feelings, to talk about them openly, that takes courage. It's a step toward clarity, even if it doesn't feel that way right now. I nodded again, wiping my tears away with the back of my hand. But even as I tried to focus on his words, I couldn't shake the weight of my own emotions. The room felt smaller, the air heavier, and I knew that if I stayed any longer, I would lose whatever fragile control I had left. I think I need to go, I said finally, my voice trembling. I need time to think. Dr. Anderson nodded, his expression unreadable. Take all the time you need, he said quietly. And remember, you're not alone in this. I left his office that night feeling more conflicted than ever. As I walked to my car, the cool night air hit my face and I took a deep, shuddering breath. I knew I was standing at a crossroads, and whichever path I chose, there would be no turning back. The drive home that night was quiet, the hum of the engine and the faint rhythm of my own heartbeat the only sounds keeping me company. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, my knuckles white, as if holding on to it could somehow steady the turmoil inside me. The streets were nearly empty, the faint glow of streetlights stretching out ahead of me like a path I didn't know how to follow. My mind raced, replaying the conversation with Dr. Anderson over and over again. His words, his voice, the way he had looked at me, they were all imprinted in my mind, vivid and unshakable. I pulled into the driveway of our house, the warm glow of the porch light spilling onto the pavement. Greg's car was parked neatly beside mine, as it always was, and for a moment I just sat there, staring at the house. It looked so ordinary, so unchanged, like a picture of stability. But inside, everything felt different. Inside, I was different. I couldn't go back to pretending that things were fine. Not tonight. When I finally stepped inside, the house was quiet, save for the faint murmur of the television in the living room. Greg was sitting on the couch, his legs stretched out, a beer in his hand. He glanced up as I walked in, his expression unreadable, then turned back to the screen. It was such a simple gesture, so typical of him, yet it made my chest tighten with a mix of frustration and sadness. How had we become this? Two people living in the same house but existing in completely separate worlds. Hey, he said casually, not taking his eyes off the TV. You're back late. I stayed for a longer session, I replied, setting my bag down by the door. My voice sounded flat even to my own ears, but I didn't know how else to speak to him. Not when the weight of everything between us felt so suffocating. Another breakthrough? He asked, his tone light, almost dismissive, as though therapy were some kind of trivial indulgence I was entertaining. I wanted to snap at him, to tell him that he had no right to dismiss something that I was clinging to so desperately. But I didn't. I just stood there staring at him, my hands trembling slightly. I'm trying, Greg, I said finally, my voice quieter than I intended. I'm trying to figure things out. For both of us. He glanced at me then, his expression softening slightly, but there was a weariness in his eyes that made my stomach turn. I know you are, he said. I don't know. I don't know how to fix this either. The honesty in his voice caught me off guard. And for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. It was the closest he'd come to admitting that things weren't okay, that we were barely holding on. But even so, it wasn't enough. Felt too little, too late. I think we need to talk, I said, taking a tentative step toward him. Yeah, sure, he said, sitting up straighter, his tone guarded now. What's on your mind? I hesitated, the words caught in my throat. How could I possibly explain everything I was feeling? How could I tell him that I didn't know if I loved him anymore? That I didn't know if I even wanted to save our marriage? How could I tell him about the growing attachment I felt for someone else, someone who wasn't him? I don't know if this is working, I said finally, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. My voice trembled, and I felt my chest tighten as I saw the flicker of hurt in his eyes. What do you mean? He asked, his voice quiet, cautious. I mean us, I said, my hands shaking now. I feel like we're just existing. Like we're roommates, not partners. And I don't know how to fix it. I don't even know if I want to fix it. The silence that followed was deafening. Greg stared at me, his face a mixture of shock and confusion, as though he couldn't quite process what I was saying. Then, slowly, he set his beer down on the coffee table and leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. So that's it, he said finally, his voice low. You're giving up? I'm not giving up, I said, my voice rising slightly. I've been trying, Greg. I've been trying so hard to figure out what's wrong and how to fix it. But it feels like I'm the only one who cares, the only one who's even willing to admit there's a problem. That's not fair, he said, his tone defensive now. I know things aren't perfect, but I've been trying too. I've been giving you space, letting you do this therapy thing. This therapy thing? I interrupted, my voice sharper than I intended. This isn't just some hobby I'm doing for fun, Greg. This is my life, our life, and I'm trying to save it. But I can't do it alone. He sighed, running a hand through his hair, his frustration evident. I don't know what you want from me, he said finally. I'm here, aren't I? I'm still here. But you're not, Greg, I said, my voice breaking. You're physically here, but emotionally? You've been gone for a long time. The words hung in the air between us, heavy and undeniable. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the weight of the truth settling over us like a suffocating blanket. And in that silence, I felt the full weight of my own guilt and confusion. I wanted to blame him for everything, for the distance, the loneliness, the aching void I felt every day. But I knew it wasn't that simple. I knew I wasn't blameless. Finally, Greg stood up, his movements slow and deliberate. He looked at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable, and then he spoke, his voice quiet but firm. I don't know what you want me to say, Claire. If you want out, just say it. But don't stand there and act like I'm the only one who's been distant. His words hit me like a slap, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. He was right. I had been distant too. I had been pulling away, retreating into myself, into therapy, into the complicated mess of emotions I couldn't untangle. But instead of addressing it, I had been blaming him, using his silence as an excuse to avoid my own. I don't want out, I said finally, my voice trembling. But I don't know how to stay either. I don't know how to keep pretending that everything's okay when it's not. Greg nodded slowly, his expression resigned. Then maybe we stop pretending, he said. Maybe we stop trying so hard to fix something that's already broken. His words cut deep, and I felt the tears welling up again. But I didn't let them fall. Instead, I turned away, unable to face the weight of his gaze. I'm going to bed, I said quietly, my voice barely audible. I didn't wait for him to respond. I climbed the stairs to our bedroom, my legs feeling heavy, my chest tight with a mixture of sadness and relief. As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't stop thinking about Dr. Anderson, about the way he had looked at me, the way he had listened to me, the way he had made me feel seen in a way Greg never had. The days that followed felt like I was walking through a fog. Every interaction with Greg was strained, every glance between us heavy with the unspoken weight of our conversation that night. He had retreated into his usual silence, but now it wasn't just passive. It was palpable, like a wall growing higher between us with every passing hour. I told myself that I needed to focus, to figure out what I wanted. But the truth was, I couldn't think about Greg without my mind drifting to Dr. Anderson. His words, his voice, the warmth in his eyes, they haunted me. I hated myself for it. I hated that I couldn't shake this growing pull toward him, even as my marriage crumbled around me. But at the same time, I couldn't deny how alive I felt in his presence. It was as if the parts of me that had been numb for so long were finally waking up. I tried to push the thoughts aside to focus on work, on errands, on anything that would distract me, but it was useless. Every time my phone buzzed with a reminder of my next session, my stomach twisted with anticipation and guilt. When the day of my next appointment finally came, I found myself standing outside Dr. Anderson's office 10 minutes early, my heart pounding in my chest. I had rehearsed what I was going to say, telling myself that I needed to set boundaries, to be honest about my feelings and take a step back. But as I sat in the waiting room, staring at the muted artwork on the walls, I realized I wasn't sure if I even wanted to step back. That thought scared me more than anything. Claire. His voice broke through my thoughts, calm and steady, as he appeared in the doorway. He smiled, that familiar, reassuring smile that always seemed to make the chaos inside me quiet, if only for a moment. Come on in. I followed him into the office, my legs feeling heavy, as though every step was pulling me deeper into something I couldn't escape. The door clicked shut behind me, and I sat down in the chair across from him, my hands clasped tightly in my lap. He settled into his own chair, leaning forward slightly, his posture open and attentive. "How have you been?" he asked, his voice gentle. I hesitated, unsure of how to answer. The truth felt too raw, too tangled to put into words. "I've been thinking," I said finally, my voice quieter than I intended. "Thinking about what?" he prompted, his gaze steady. "Everything," I admitted. "My marriage. My choices. Myself. I feel like I'm stuck in this place where I don't know which way to go, and no matter what I do, it feels like I'm going to lose something. Or someone." Dr. Anderson nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "That's an incredibly difficult place to be," he said. "Feeling torn between what you want, what you think you should do, and what you fear. It can be overwhelming." "It is," I said, my voice cracking slightly. "I don't even know what I want anymore. I thought I came here to fix my marriage, but now, I'm not sure if that's even possible, or if I even want it to be." He tilted his head slightly, studying me. "What do you feel when you think about your marriage? Not what you think you should feel. What do you actually feel?" The question hung in the air, and I felt my chest tighten as I searched for an answer. "I feel tired," I said finally. "I feel like I've been fighting for something that isn't there anymore, and maybe hasn't been for a long time." Dr. Anderson nodded, his expression softening. "That kind of exhaustion can be incredibly draining. It's okay to acknowledge that. It doesn't mean you failed. It just means you're human." I looked down at my hands, my fingers twisting the edge of my sweater. "But it feels like failure," I whispered. "I feel like I've failed him, failed myself, failed at being the person I'm supposed to be." "Sometimes," he said gently, "failure is just a step toward clarity. It's not about what you couldn't do. It's about what you've learned from it." His words washed over me, soothing and yet unsettling at the same time. I wanted to believe him, to let go of the guilt and shame that had been weighing me down. But as I looked at him, as I felt the warmth of his gaze, I knew there was more I needed to say. More I couldn't keep buried any longer. "There's something else," I said, my voice trembling. "Something I've been afraid to admit." He leaned back slightly, his expression open but cautious. "You can say whatever you need to hear," he said. "This is a safe space." I hesitated, my heart racing as I tried to find the right words. "I think I've been using therapy as an escape," I said finally. "Not just from my marriage, but from myself. And from feelings I know I shouldn't have." His expression didn't change, but I thought I saw a flicker of understanding in his eyes. "What kind of feelings?" he asked gently. I took a deep breath, the words catching in my throat. "Feelings about you," I said finally, my voice barely audible. The room felt impossibly still, the air between us heavy with the weight of my confession. I couldn't bring myself to look at him, my gaze fixed on my trembling hands. For a moment he didn't say anything, and the silence felt like it would swallow me whole. "Claire," he said finally, his voice calm but firm. "It's not uncommon to develop feelings of attachment in a therapeutic setting. It's part of the dynamic, a result of the trust and connection that's built here. But it's important to understand those feelings in the context of the work we're doing." "I know," I said quickly, my voice shaking. "I know it's not real. I know it's just because you've been there for me in a way no one else has. But it feels real." And I don't know how to stop feeling this way. He leaned forward slightly, his expression still composed but softer now. The feelings you're experiencing, they're valid. They're a reflection of the vulnerability and openness you've allowed yourself to feel in this space. But they're not a solution. They're not a way out of the pain you're experiencing. I don't want to feel this way, I said, tears welling up in my eyes. I don't want to confuse everything even more than it already is. But I don't know how to stop. He let out a quiet sigh, his gaze never leaving mine. The most important thing you can do right now is be honest with yourself. Not just about what you're feeling, but about why. This isn't about me. It's about what you need, what you're searching for. His words stung, not because they were harsh, but because they were true. This wasn't about him, not really. It was about the void inside me, the aching loneliness that I had been trying to fill for so long. And as much as I wanted to believe that he was the answer, I knew deep down that he couldn't be. I'm sorry, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. I didn't mean to. You don't need to apologize, he interrupted gently. There's no shame in what you're feeling. But part of this process is learning to sit with those feelings, to understand them, without letting them dictate your actions. I nodded, wiping the tears from my cheeks. I don't know how to do that, I admitted. You're already doing it, he said. By acknowledging it, by talking about it, you're taking the first step. And I'm here to help you navigate it. His words were kind, but they didn't ease the ache in my chest. As I left his office that evening, I felt a strange mix of relief and despair. I had been honest, had confronted the feelings that had been consuming me, but it didn't make them disappear. If anything, they felt even more present, more impossible to ignore. That night I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling as shadows from the moonlight danced across the walls. Greg was beside me, his steady breathing a reminder of how far apart we had grown, even in the same space. My body felt heavy, weighed down by the emotions I couldn't escape. I kept replaying Dr. Anderson's words in my head, the way he had looked at me, the firmness in his voice as he urged me to confront my feelings. It was the truth I hadn't wanted to hear. That this wasn't about him. It was about me. But that realization didn't make it any easier. If anything, it made it harder. I had spent so much time blaming my marriage, blaming Greg, blaming the circumstances of my life for the emptiness I felt. And now I was being forced to look inward, to admit that the void wasn't something external. It was mine, and it had been there for a long time, long before things had started falling apart with Greg. I turned over, trying to shut my mind off, but sleep wouldn't come. Instead, I found myself staring at Greg's back, at the rise and fall of his shoulders. There was a time when that sight had comforted me, when his presence beside me had felt like safety. But now it felt like a reminder of everything we had lost, everything we couldn't seem to find again. I wondered if he was awake, if he could feel the tension in the air as strongly as I could. But I didn't reach out. I couldn't. The gap between us felt too wide, and I didn't know how to bridge it anymore. The next morning, the house was quiet as I got up and went through the motions of my routine. Greg had already left for work, leaving a half-empty coffee cup on the counter, and a silence that felt heavier than words. I stared at the cup for a moment, at the faint lipstick mark from where he had kissed me on the cheek out of habit before heading out the door. It was such a small thing, something I would have barely noticed before, but now it felt significant. A remnant of a connection that had once been effortless but now felt forced. I couldn't stay in the house. The walls felt too close, the silence too loud. I grabbed my keys and drove aimlessly, letting the road unfold in front of me without any real destination in mind. The streets were busy with people going about their lives, and for a moment I envied them. They all seemed to know where they were going, what they wanted. I wondered how many of them felt like I did, trapped in a life that looked fine from the outside but felt hollow on the inside. Without meaning to, I found myself driving toward Dr. Anderson's office. I wasn't scheduled for a session that day, but the pull was too strong to ignore. I parked a block away, my hands gripping the steering wheel as I debated whether I should go inside. Part of me knew it wasn't a good idea, that showing up unannounced would only complicate things further. But another part of me, desperate, lost, just wanted to see him, to feel that sense of steadiness he always seemed to provide. I didn't go inside. Instead, I sat there in my car, staring at the building, my mind racing. What was I doing? Why couldn't I let this go? The truth was, I didn't trust myself anymore. I didn't trust my motives, my emotions, or the choices I was making. And that terrified me. When I finally drove away, I felt a strange mix of relief and regret. I had resisted the urge to see him, to cling to him as a way of avoiding my own pain. But I knew the feelings weren't going to disappear just because I had walked away. They were still there, simmering beneath the surface, waiting for the next moment of weakness to rise up again. At home, I tried to focus on work, on cleaning the house, on anything that would keep my mind occupied. But everything felt hollow, like I was going through the motions without any real purpose. I couldn't stop thinking about Greg, about Dr. Anderson, about the tangled mess of my life. I wanted to fix it, to find a way out of the fog, but I didn't know where to start. That evening, Greg came home later than usual. He looked tired, his shirt wrinkled and his tie loosened around his neck. He gave me a small nod as he walked past me into the kitchen, opening the fridge and grabbing a beer. I watched him, waiting for him to say something, but he didn't. He just stood there, leaning against the counter, staring at the floor. "How was your day?" I asked finally, my voice hesitant. "Fine," he said, not looking up. "Work was busy." I nodded, unsure of what else to say. The silence stretched between us, thick and uncomfortable, until I couldn't take it anymore. "Greg," I said, my voice trembling slightly, "we need to talk." He looked up then, his expression guarded. "About what?" "About us," I said. "About everything. I can't keep pretending like everything's okay when it's not." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I know things haven't been great," he said slowly. "But I don't know what you want me to do, Claire. I'm trying, but it feels like nothing I do is enough." "It's not about what you're doing," I said, my frustration bubbling to the surface. "It's about what we're not doing. We don't talk, we don't connect, we're just existing. And I don't know if that's enough for me anymore." His jaw tightened, and I could see the hurt in his eyes. "So what are you saying?" he asked. "That you want out?" "I don't know," I admitted, tears welling up in my eyes. "I don't know what I want. All I know is that I can't keep living like this. I feel like I'm disappearing." "Disappearing?" he repeated, his voice rising slightly. "What about me, Claire? You think I don't feel that way too? You think I haven't noticed how distant you've been? How you don't even look at me the same way anymore? You're not the only one who's struggling here." His words hit me like a slap, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. He was right. I wasn't the only one who was hurting, the only one who felt lost. But the realization didn't bring me any closer to an answer. It only made everything feel more tangled, more impossible to fix. "I don't know what to do," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to fix this." Greg looked at me for a long moment, his expression softening. "Maybe we can't fix it," he said quietly. "Maybe we just need to figure out if it's worth trying." His words hung in the air between us, heavy and undeniable. I didn't know what to say, didn't know how to respond. All I knew was that we were standing on the edge of something, and whichever way we turned, nothing would ever be the same again. The weight of Greg's words lingered in the air long after he said them, a suffocating presence I couldn't shake. He stood there in the kitchen, beer in hand, his eyes scanning my face as if searching for a response I wasn't ready to give. I could feel my chest tightening, the tears welling up behind my eyes, but I swallowed hard and forced them back. Breaking down in front of him wasn't going to help either of us. "I don't know if I can answer that right now," I said quietly, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to steady it.